Hello and welcome to The Cynic. I'm Christopher Gallagher. As you're aware, there are no Cynic Weekly podcasts being released over the summer. Instead, we will be releasing podcasts that give you a flavour of what we are doing at thecynic.co. We are creating regular Celtic podcasts over the summer, which becomes daily podcasts throughout the season. For a monthly fee, you can get access to thousands of these podcasts, covering a host of different subjects. We are currently producing 3 weekly news pods, as well as a feature pod, but our back catalogue is full of quality content. Today we are releasing our podcast that analyses the tactics of Brendan Rodgers. This was released in June as part of a series that focuses on the return of Brendan Rodgers. To get access to the rest of the series, simply visit thecynic.co for full details. Hello and welcome to Tactics Corner. I'm Christopher Gallagher, and today we're going to discuss and analyse the tactics, style and philosophy of new Celtic manager Brendan Rodgers. Today I'm joined by Christian Wulff. Hello Christian, how are you?
I'm good, Christopher.
Lovely stuff, nice and short there. And I'm delighted to say we are joined once again by writer and presenter at Tifo Football, Jon MacKenzie. Hello Jon, how are you, sir?
Hello, it's great to have you. It's great to have me back. It's great to be back.
Great stuff. We're going to focus on tactics today, and his style and philosophy and how it's changed and such. So, Jon, I want to throw you out a kind of opening question: is Brendan Rodgers a good continuity appointment, moving on from Ange Postecoglou, or does it bring challenges?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I've been thinking about how to answer this one because I guess you can take the word continuity on a number of different levels. If we're talking about tactically, I suppose there is similarities between Ange Postecoglou and Brendan Rodgers insofar as they play or have played similar shapes, similar structures.
Yeah.
And Brendan Rodgers, he's nominally like a possession-heavy coach as well. So in that respect, the similarities are there with Ange Postecoglou. But I think that in terms of what the Celtic board will be thinking about in terms of continuity is probably not quite as much the tactical side of things as I suppose the bigger question that they have to face, which is how do we keep ahead of Rangers in the race for the Premiership. And in that respect, I think that they will consider him a safe bet. You never want to see your manager go because he's been so successful. But if he does go, I suppose the next best thing is to bring someone in who's been successful before. Whether or not the logic works is a completely different question entirely. But I do think that will be their thinking. Their thinking there is we want to keep this momentum that we have. We want to do everything that we can do to stay ahead of Rangers in the Premiership race. And I think at the end of last season with Michael Beale at Rangers, the gap had narrowed a lot. And so, yeah, I think that the way that they'll be thinking about the continuity here is here's a manager who can keep the momentum up and make next season as pain-free as possible in terms of like any teething pains with a new manager.
Yeah, absolutely. Christian, you want to come in?
Yeah, Jon, obviously it's probably a reflection of how old we're getting, but I feel like Brendan Rodgers just started out. It's been 13 years since he took over Swansea. He was only 37. And I think, we're not going to do a full tactical biography of Rodgers, but coming through at Swansea, obviously he was 13 years is a long time in football, first of all, but he was very much remembering back, seen as a possession, as you say, a possession heavy coach, and the kind of tactical landscape at that point, obviously it's a few years after like Pep's Barcelona team and so on. I think it was very much seen at the time as, obviously he was just 37, as a young kind of innovative manager at the time. If you kind of cast your mind back, Jon, what was your kind of first impression of Brendan Rodgers and his like style of football?
It's 13 years ago is a long time. I thought you were going to say 13 years since he joined Celtic. I was like, dear me, it's not that long, is it? But, yeah, it's a long old time since his Swansea days. He was remembered for being, a high possession, very patient build-up coach. I haven't gone back and watched any of his time at Swansea recently, but I do have friends who tell me that a lot of what he was doing back then was just, very slow build up and then trying to hit long balls in behind for strikers to run onto. And I suppose the big question that I would have with Brendan Rodgers is all about timing. In what sense was he ahead of the curve on certain areas, both in and out of possession? And to what extent has, I suppose, what would be classed as a bit of a decline in his recent career comes from the fact that a lot of coaches have now caught up with him in terms of the level that he's at. Now, I think that's potentially incredibly unfair. So I'm saying that with a huge dollop of salt. But the impression that I've got is that both in terms of what he was doing in possession and particularly in terms of some of the high pressing ideas that he brought in at Swansea and at Liverpool, I think he was very much ahead of the curve and got an upside there. In preparing for this interview, I did my best to try and find anything tactics-wise written or produced or videoed about Brendan Rodgers, and it's really hard to find anything out there. I'm not sure why that is the case. Whether or not it's because people don't find him that tactically interesting, I don't know. But there's a couple of pieces on the Coach's Voice that are out there if people want to look them up. And then there's a piece on Spielverlagerung, the German tactics blog, which focuses on his second full season at Leicester. And again, the way that piece concludes is kind of interesting because it says, Brendan Rodgers has built an intelligent team at Leicester. But the big question that we have is how much is it the case that his football is reliant on players? So there's certain players in his system that were important for it and gave it that upside. And so again, I wonder whether or not the best way of talking about Brendan Rodgers tactically is that he's going to be a guy who's going to just make a solid base for his players to play out of. And if he has the quality of players there, then that will work fine. Whether or not he's the sort of tactical guy who is going to be able to recognize in real time problems and solve those problems, I think is maybe another question. And again, it's not one I feel qualified to answer in any deep way, but I do think that's I do think that may be one way of being able to explain the way that Brendan Rodgers has gone from being a coach who's very highly thought of to maybe to being a coach who's seen a team basically get relegated recently.
Great points. And looking back at his first stint at Celtic, one of the biggest things that the support really liked was his ability to influence a match and to change things up. And that idea of it's not working out, so what we're going to do is we're going to change. One of the best kind of examples of that was the game against Motherwell when we were, I think, 3-1 down and we come back to win 4-3, and it was all about how he changed it, his in-game changes. We did the managers search series when we were looking at who could have came in, and you were talking about Graham Potter and him being pragmatic. Is pragmatism something that you would kind of put Rodgers in that kind of... Is he a pragmatic manager essentially, or is he, because he doesn't really have that dogmatic approach the way Postecoglou did?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think that I really want to make sure that I'm breaking down what I think is going on with Brendan Rodgers, because I think that there's a couple of levels, as I've already said, to what his approach is. You've said the word pragmatism, and there's an extent to which I agree with you, but I think I just want to give a little bit of an anecdote, because the first time I was really exposed to Brendan Rodgers from a tactical point of view was in the first season where Leeds were back in the Premier League, because I was spending a huge amount of time doing tactical analysis on the various games in that season. And it was, really interesting, because that season was the season when Brendan Rodgers had a couple of different approaches that he would take with his football club at Leicester at the time. At home, he would play 4-2-3-1 shape, and the idea was that they were going to try and dominate oppositions because they felt at home they should be dictating the play. And then away from home, they had this slightly more solid 3-4-3 shape, which they tended to use just to try and, I guess, offer a solid base from which to attack out of and then try and hit teams on the break. So the first game that they played was against Leeds at Elland Road, and because they were playing away from home, they played in that 3-4-3 shape, and it actually caused Leeds a huge amount of problems from a tactical point of view, and they ended up winning 4-1 in that game. scored a couple of goals really early on and just pulled us to pieces. Now, in the return fixture at the King Power, despite the fact that there was, I think, very obvious tactical advantages that they got from the 3-4-3 shape, which had caused us problems, Brendan Rodgers went back and changed the shape to a 4-2-3-1, which is what he was doing at home at the time, and actually ended up losing the game 3-1. And at half time, I think they switched back to the 3-4-3 shape. So obviously there was the ability to switch between those shapes, which is, I think, indication of a manager who is tactically aware and tactically competent. But I always found that really interesting that they'd caused us so many problems in the original 3-4-3 shape at Elland Road, but then had come back to the King Power Stadium and been like, no, we should be dominating this game, therefore we should be playing out of this 4-2-3-1 shape. That it's always raised questions for me about how you go out and you analyse that game and you think, well, with a team like Leeds, Leeds are the opposite, right? They're the highly idealistic under Marcelo Bielsa, structurally repetitive in many respects. So you know exactly that one of the beauties of covering Marcelo Bielsa at that time is you could name the Leeds starting formation pretty much every time before the game, just based on what the opposition were playing. So that was just the first sort of inkling that I had that maybe there's something. But pragmatism maybe is the right word to use there, which is we prep for this one way of doing things, and then we prep for this other way of doing things in a different situation, regardless of what's happened in the original one. And I think that that's sort of maybe where Brendan Rodgers has sort of lost his edge, perhaps. Maybe more of the coaches who are coming through now are a bit more flexible tactically in terms of they're going to be thinking about different phases of play. They're going to be thinking about how you cause problems in against certain structures in build up. And that's not to say that I don't think Brendan Rodgers is doing that, but I do think that he maybe has some set ideas about this is how we do our build up. There will be a bit of flexibility. So if, that there are games I've seen from his time at Leicester when he would maybe start with his fullbacks a little bit higher and wider in order to cause problems and then have his wide forwards pull inside. So you've got different players in different channels in that respect, and vice versa. If you want to play your fullbacks a little bit narrower, then you push your wide players out wide. And again, you're just inhabiting different channels on the field. But I think that nowadays that managers are much happier to be like, well, if we're building up against a back three press, a front three press, we can adopt these sorts of ideas. We can maybe have a single pivot rather than a double pivot, et cetera, et cetera. And so, maybe the distinction I'm sort of wanting to make is that he does have the ability to change things up, but there perhaps isn't quite the same level of elegance that you might get from some of the more modern, elite coaches, as well. So, I think pragmatism is a good word in that respect, but it's sort of pragmatism with a bit of flexibility, a bit more flexibility than you might expect from a lot of the pragmatic coaches.
Awesome.
John, I do want to get into like kind of his last period at Celtic a little bit more and how that continuation from Ange. But something you said there is you're saying about in terms of he can be very player orientated. And if you go back to say, his best season at Liverpool, the kind of tactical tweaks that he did this is obviously he put Steven Gerrard at the base as a deep pivot, and he put Raheem Sterling in a lot of games in the number 10 position, or at least he started at the number 10 position. You got Suarez and Sturridge on top, and then kind of, I've sent over the lineup from the away game against United in that 13-14 season when they've been 3-0, and you got Jordan Henderson and Joe Allen kind of like number 8. So that was seen as quite tactically, I guess, progressive and kind of smart. But by you saying that, it kind of also triggers me is he a coach that looks at his players and he has the tactical awareness as actually Steven Gerrard at the moment, I need to put a deep pivot. Raheem Sterling, Suarez and Sturridge should work together, but I can maybe put Sterling here. So is it a case of, as you said, with Ange's, here's my system, I don't care if you play this way, whereas Brendan Rodgers is like, okay, I got a set of players here. How can I best mold them into the best possible tactical setup for those players rather than my style?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case. I think when you look at that 4-4-2 with the diamond that you've talked about that he played at Liverpool, a lot of that team just picks itself, right? You've got to get Gerrard in there. you've got to get Sterling in there, and you probably can't play him as a wide player because you've got two strikers, right? So, I think that this reminds me a lot of Xavi at Barcelona. I think that the conversations that have happened around him this season and the way that he's turned Barcelona around are really interesting, because a lot of people like to talk about his system. But I think what he's done super well in that system is that he's found a structure that allows him to get all of his best players into positions that work for them. And I think there's an extent to which, obviously, that's a tactical reality, right? That's something that is important for coaches to do. But I think that sometimes you can get away with people thinking that you're better tactically than you are, because what you've done is you've landed on a system that allows you to get all of your best players on the field in a way that isn't too stodgy. And I think there's elements of that happening here. And I think the big question for him going forward, I suppose, is that at Celtic, I think I'm correct in thinking that he played Scott Brown as a pivot in that. Yep. In that team towards the end, and obviously Callum McGregor as an outside, was one of the eights in the midfield three. Obviously, Ange has played McGregor as a pivot player, and I suppose that represents a bit of a departure from that sort of approach. So playing a bit more of a playmaker pivot for Ange versus playing a bit more of a destroyer pivot in Scott Brown. Again, I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this, guys, because do you think that of Rodgers coming in is going to simply play the same sort of starting 11 that we saw from Ange Postecoglou, just because he'll say, well, these are the players in their best positions?
I think that's kind of where my train of thought is leading me, John, when you said that thing about, player centered, because even if you go through the team at the moment, I know I talk a lot about him, but Greg Taylor for example, is a very specific fullback. He's a fullback who is much better inverted, really, than on a traditional fullback role. And there's no really any evidence we have of Rodgers seeing that Leicester last season wanting to try and invert the fullbacks. But what you're saying there as well is obviously he is smart enough to look at that team and say, okay, we have our left back is Greg Taylor. He's really good at inverting. This is how Ange has been playing him. And so for me, it would be really interesting to see. I think that would be an early sign if Greg Taylor if Greg Taylor is playing, first of all, and if he keeps playing him, asking him to go and invert in the build-up, that's kind of then be a signal to me quite early on to see, like, well, these are the players I have. I'm not actually as dogmatic that I always need to play with wide fullbacks. I got a left back here who's really good inverting. It's been working, and let's start playing that. So I think that would be an early test. Looking back at his team when he came in, it was also, I guess you can draw parallels with the fullbacks then as well, because what he had was Kieran Tierney and Michael Lustig. So two very different fullbacks, right? And he also brought in Scott Sinclair, who, again, is a very different kind of winger than James Forrest and Paddy Roberts. So essentially, to simplify it a little bit, in possession, Celtic would push up Kieran Tierney on the left-hand side, and Scott Sinclair would come inwards from a winger position. So you almost ended up kind of like and then obviously Michael Lustig being a lot more defense-minded, or he's not, he's half a centre-back, half a full-back in a way.
Yeah.
He would sit a bit deeper, so you ended kind of up having a back three, and then you deep pivot and the two number eights, and then Tierney, Sinclair, the striker, and the right winger, like a 3-3-4. But I think that was very much based on, look, I have a more defensive-minded right back. I have two right wingers who are wingers, but I got a very offensive-minded left back, and then a left winger in Sinclair that's kind of, it likes to come in as almost like a striker. So I think looking back, Gal, I'll let you come in as well, but for me, it kind of seems like he had a look at that team and it's like, actually, I'm going to play the build-up and focus in that way because that's the strengths of my players at this point.
I think one of the funny kind of thing is that no matter how Rodgers kind of sets this Celtic team up, he's still going to have the same issues that Ange Postecoglou had, and playing out from the back is still a bit of an issue, and he had that with his time at Celtic previously. I think there's just a a whole host of questions that we're not going to have answered until he comes in, because our perception, our perception of how Rodgers played and how he did play in his first period at Celtic is very different to the players that we have at our disposal, and obviously that's due to Ange's kind of recruitment. And the big worry is he comes in and he says, like you were saying, Christian, the idea of him coming in and saying, okay, I've got these players, what's the best way to utilise this group of players? I find that more relatable than Ange being, this is the system and that's it. Just from a Celtic point of view, because we don't have we can't work in those markets.
And John, to kind of drag this analogy a bit further about player strengths. So, and to put in context, so we talked about when Rodgers came through, as young managers often do, and if they get a job early on, they're seen as tactically innovative. And we kind of touched upon that. He's probably not seen as tactically innovative anymore, which is, I guess, it's unless you're Pep, really, it's hard to kind of keep that tag and keep going with the trends of 10, 15 years. But when you said that, John, and don't laugh at this comparison, but what kind of sprung to mind was Carlo Ancelotti, which is a very much, he's coaching some of the best players in the world in Real Madrid. And as we've talked about before in this, but he's not exactly known for a complex tactical system. He just goes, well, here's your base. You're really great players. Go and play. And in terms of a Scottish sense, Celtic is Real Madrid. And it's so you do wonder, whereas Ange is dogmatic, you're going to play this way, compared to Rodgers kind of more, let the really good players play in a system that suits them kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting analogy, and in many respects, that's what you want from a coach when you're at Celtic. But I suppose the big question there is the concept of decline, and that's been the worry with Brendan Rodgers now for his last few coaching stints, right? And it's all well and good bringing him in and getting him sort of fielding a team that works, plays in their best position, often, coming into teams where they've actually had a talent advantage, right? He's been at Liverpool and then Celtic, and then even with Leicester. I mean, he came in when Leicester had won the Premier League and were enjoying the benefits of Champions League revenue as well. That talent advantage, able to make the most of it in the short term, definitely. But the longer that he was at a club, the more there was that decline there. And there's been suggestions that part of the problem is that he has too much of a say in recruitment, and as a result of that, the player base that he starts with ends up being very different from the player base that he ends up with, and that not being an ideal position. But I think in the big question with him coming in at Celtic now is the fact that he is coming into a system where that everyone knows what they're doing in every phase of play, and they have clear ideas about what that should be, and they've seen very obviously what the upsides of that approach are. And I think it's going to be difficult for him to be able to get any buy-in with these players unless he can do the same thing and implement a system that has obvious upside. So you mentioned before Greg Taylor playing inverted. I'd be amazed if he plays Greg Taylor inverted, simply because, one, he's never done that before. Yeah. And two, I think a big part of his in possession play is about wide combinations which allow him to progress the ball down the field. So I think if Greg Taylor is playing, he will be expected to do that he does use underlaps, right? So there's still that aspect to it, and I think that's has been a really important part of his game. So I do think that Taylor will suit that, but a lot of that is based around having a wide player outside the underlapping fullback. And it's there's no ideas there about rest defense. So thinking about what happens if you turn over the ball. And it's also a very much like a vertical thing, which again, I think you see happening under Ange a lot. I think it's maybe time for us to start distinguishing between, inverting fullbacks and underlapping fullbacks, because I think, there's a sense in which, when Pep Guardiola or Mikel Arteta are inverting their fullbacks, a lot of that is about actually adding another player to the midfield, giving you a little bit of defensive solidity, but also, making it easier for you to progress the ball through build-up. Whereas I think when Ange, or someone like Erik ten Hag, who actually I think is very similar to what Ange is doing, when they're inverting their fullbacks, there's often a lot more focus on verticality, so moving the ball quickly, trying to have half spaces free and open for someone to move into. Now that can be the 8, can be the fullback as well. So I think there was a goal scored, was it against Aberdeen towards the end of this season, where I think it was the first goal in that game, was it 4-0, 4-1 win? Where Greg Taylor picks the ball up in the half space in quite an advanced position and is able to play the ball inside, and the goal is scored from there. For me, that's more underlapping fullback kind of territory. And I think we will see that from Brendan Rodgers. So I think there's going to be similarities there, but this is going to be a team in Brendan Rodgers' image rather than Ange's image. So I think we should expect to see similar sorts of ideas. You talked about about KT playing as a a flying fullback, getting into that front line, they're forming a situational back three with the remaining defensive line. I think that's the sort of thing that we will see. I think that's just the way Brendan Rodgers has done things always, and I'd be amazed to see him start introducing more positional ideas like that into his play in terms of inverting fullbacks. But you never know. There's always a chance to change. I watched Marcelo Bielsa's Uruguay team play against Nicaragua the other night, and they stopped man marking, and they're playing a bit more of a zonal out of possession system. So if Marcelo Bielsa can change, anyone can.
It's just nice to see eyes lit up there, John, when he's talking about Marcelo. So I guess in general terms, as you say, a lot of this is a little bit unknown for us. And I guess that is one of the characteristics of Brendan Rodgers right now, that with Ange, I kind of already know how Ange wants Spurs to play and how they will try to play. But I guess the characteristic of Brendan Rodgers is that we're not quite sure. And that it'd be interesting. We know he's a lot about suiting the players, as you say. But we also don't know to the degree he's going to utilize that squad as well.
Can I ask you both? Can I ask you both a question? Is there any chance that Rodgers is coming up here, and I hate to say this, but coming up here to experiment a little bit? We're really questioning. He's 50, so he's still relatively young, right, in the old manager's game. But is there a chance that he's coming back up to Celtic to try things out? Obviously, how everything that happened at Leicester, it was kind of a drop off in that kind of the final season, obviously with the relegation and stuff. But is there a chance he kind of is using this as a way to test new ideas that he can implement potentially further forward in his career?
I think it's a really fascinating question, because it feels to me, and this is just my take, that he's just trying to relive the magic that he had the last time he was at Celtic Park. In terms of innovation, I actually think it's going to be a really tough season next season. I mentioned before the underlying data towards the end of the season had Michael Beale sort of neck and neck with Ange Postecoglou, which is no mean feat. And with the continuity of having a full pre-season to work with players on stuff that in a second season you can do a lot of work, I think, in that pre-season between your first and second season. I think Rangers are going to be a tough prospect this season. So I think that will probably dissuade Brendan Rodgers from wanting to try and innovate too much, right? Because he won't have the breathing room to be able to do that. So I think it feels to me more like Brendan Rodgers wanting to come back to Celtic and be like, look, guys, I am a good coach. Look, I can still win in these sorts of conditions. Whether or not he feels as though he's going back with his tail between his legs, I don't know. But it does feel from the perspective of someone who followed Celtic fairly externally when he was playing, that the Celtic fans really didn't like it when he left and the manner in which he left. And so for him to go back is kind of brave in that respect. And like I say, with the context of now Rangers seeming to be in a better situation, I think there's a lot riding on this, and it could be a tough time for him.
I'm going to come in. I got kind of, I guess, two questions left. First one is that kind of, we touched upon it, but that concept of keeping yourself tactically relevant and effective over a longer period of time. So I know football has moved, they move on quickly, but I think one of the things that allowed Alex Ferguson to kind of keep recreating teams was that he was happy to bring in assistant managers, Carlos Queiroz and so on, who would help him do that. And he would kind of, you can almost kind of slightly draw a parallel with Klopp as well. He's got different assistant managers, like someone like Pep Linders is coming and have a big impact. And then you have like the natural, I guess, tactics obsessives like Pep and Marcelo Bielsa, who always try to do that himself also. But so I'm kind of trying, and then again, you got guys like, the accusation against Jose Mourinho and then a bit before that, Rafa Benitez, is that they didn't really change and they kind of stuck to that. I do wonder if Brendan Rodgers is probably coming into a phase now, and this kind of relates to what Gal said as well, that he, unless he's still very tactically curious and want to evolve, if he's not that kind of type, and I don't know if he is really, he would probably also rely on his backroom staff and his kind of coaches to kind of drive that innovation. And I know, me and Gal will talk about this on other pod in terms of his backroom stuff. I know there was quite a kind of hive mind tactically last time at Celtic. So I guess the hope is that he takes on a role a bit more like Ferguson or Klopp, where he's the figurehead, he's the one who sets the standards, but a lot of that innovative ideas maybe come from his staff.
Yeah, I'm sure that's the case. And look, we know Jack Lyons is working with him, and Jack Lyons is far smarter than I'll ever be. So I feel a bit of a fraud sort of sitting here, you're pontificating about Brendan.
I'm not sure, John. I know you both. And
well, it's all well and good for me to sort of sit here in my bedroom pontificating about what Brendan Rodgers should
like a stereotype.
Like the stereotype football nerd virgin, right? But at the same time, like, I think that the difficulty with innovation at the tactical level is never about having the ideas. The ideas are easy. There's always ways of finding solutions to problems in the theoretical. The problem is always the practical unfolding of those ideas. And part of the issue is that football managers never really have the space and time to be able to develop those ideas. And look at them, look at the coaches who are successful. On the one hand, they remain at clubs for so long because they are successful, but also they stay at clubs for so long because I think they realize that that central to the concept of innovation is the ability to have that base level that you're working from, that you can then introduce tweaks as you go and develop a playing squad who can actually respond to those things. So look, innovation is a really tough thing. And, it's a testament to how good Pep Guardiola is that he can do what he does on a regular basis. He can go into a Champions League final and say, we're going to play a 4-4-2 diamond, with John Stones playing as a number 8, which we've never done before. And it kind of works and kind of doesn't work, and they end up winning anyway. But like, the ability for him to be able to do that, the ability for him to say midway through a game, right, we've been pressing through the middle with our front two, starting the press. We're now going to have the front two withdrawn a bit, and we're going to have the wingers jumping on the press. And actually, we'll start with the right hand side doing a bit more of an aggressive press, so the left hand side drops in a little bit. For him to be able to do that in a dressing room at half time and have the players functionally make those changes is remarkable and very difficult. So to come back to your original point, I wonder again whether or not you mentioned Carlo Ancelotti, and Carlo Ancelotti is a very Marmite figure, but Carlo Ancelotti's thing is that he can manage at the highest level because he is able to work with those sorts of players. And I wonder whether or not Brendan Rodgers going back to Celtic is perhaps an admission that he likes being a coach of a club that are at the top level in the league that they're in. So we know that Leeds were pretty desperate to get Brendan Rodgers and were offering a lot of money. But the possibility of going into the Championship and then getting promoted into the Premier League, and regardless of how well he did or didn't do that, even if Leeds got into the Premier League, they were never going to be, an elite team unless something drastic changed, and it would take 20 years or so for that to happen. When you go back to Celtic, you know exactly what the state of affairs is, and you can say to yourself, look, the best times I've had coaching have been at Liverpool when we had like a talent advantage relative to the league. Celtic, where I had talent advantage relative to the league, and the first few seasons of Leicester, where we had a talent advantage relative to the league. Let's just go back to a situation where I can have that talent advantage, and I think that this brings out the best in my coaching approach. And I think that's probably what's happened. He's probably weighed up the options that he's had and decided that he likes the style that coaching Celtic offers him there. So yeah, I think that will be what will happen. But yeah, I do think it's fascinating, this idea of like, what is it that Brendan Rodgers does? Why is it that there's so few tactical treatments of him on the internet? People are desperate to write about any basic tactics for any coach that has existed. And Brendan Rodgers is, a bona fide great British coach, right? You would think that there'd be loads of things out there, but there isn't. So I wonder whether or not the Leicester City stint for him has made him rethink like approaches to various things. Maybe we will see some changes. Maybe we will see him trying to innovate a little bit. But for me, I think this is probably just a little bit more about him getting back in his lane and saying, right, let's get back to where I was at and show the people I can do what I can do, and then maybe start again, go somewhere else and start from scratch there.
Jon, that would have been a great way of ending the podcast, but I'm not going to get my last question in. Sorry. It's just a really quick one. On the Manager Shortlist series, we obviously talked a lot about this need for Celtic to combine domestic dominance of teams, like huge talent advantages, and then go straight into an away game against Real Madrid. Kind of Rodgers' experience with Leicester, where he's have a good team, top half team, but he will need to be, as we mentioned, tactically flexible. Maybe he needs to be tactically flexible against really good teams. We talked about how he switched to a 3 against tougher teams sometimes, and that as well. Do you see that at least that as kind of that pragmatism or that flexibility to go play a certain way, home against Ross County, but then see when we face, PSG away, maybe that's a bad example, but Juventus away, is that kind of experience of being at Leicester kind of lets him then, bring that flexibility and at least wanting to switch maybe to back 3 in those cases?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wonder whether or not his time at Leicester has made him a little bit more amenable in the group stages of the Champions League. It's a possibility for sure. I think that I don't know how they will be approaching the Champions League, because I suppose the Champions League isn't going to really fully kick off until the Premiership is well underway, right? So it could be the case at that point that the top of the table tussle is quite intense, and so it could be the case that the Champions League takes a little bit of a back seat. But I think the thing that I'm really interested in about, and this is to maybe go off on a tangent that probably isn't very welcome, but is obviously the big difference is going to be how well you can play against the teams who aren't in the whole firm, right? And the reality is that teams now sit deep against Celtic because of Ange Postecoglou, and Ange Postecoglou is one of the best coaches I've ever seen in terms of breaking down low blocks. Yeah. And obviously, I don't think Brendan Rodgers has had to do that quite so much in recent seasons, certainly not in the last season. So for me, the big question is how he's going to function against those other teams, because there's a sense in which, it doesn't matter how you stack up against Rangers in terms of results. I always feel uncomfortable talking about Rangers on this podcast. So if I'm ever overstepping the mark, just tell me to pipe down.
We'll just cut that. Yeah.
But those results obviously they obviously matter in terms of you want to win them. You want your team to be better than your fierce rivals. But you can win the league without necessarily winning all of the old firm games. And so I think that the big question is going to be for him, how successful is he going to be in all the other games? Because if you can do that, and if you can be solid in those games, then it doesn't really matter what happens in terms of at least the pure points that you're going to get from the old firm games, and those games do become about bragging rights as much as anything. So I think that's sort of where I'm at with the Brendan Rodgers thing with Celtic. So it'll be interesting. And I hope I haven't been too negative about him, because I think he's a good solid coach, and I think I can see, again, we talked about Graham Potter a few days ago, and it's similar to me for that. I think Potter is the more tactical coach of the two, but we were saying that, you know, you can go for someone really fun. You can go for a Francesco Farioli. You can go for a Andoni Iraola, and those coaches are really fun for dweebs like Christian and me, because
in their bedrooms.
You get to enjoy an aspect of football which most fans don't care about. But when it comes to Celtic, what the board are thinking of is like, what's the most efficient way for us to get results? And that's very much the reason why they brought Brendan Rodgers in, because they know he has a proven track record at Celtic of being able to do that. Now, I think the conditions are different, and so it's going to be fascinating to see how that plays out. I don't think Rangers really had any great coaches when Brendan Rodgers was at Celtic, but I think that, yeah, this is where it's going to be fascinating, because he's not going to be able to shithouse this. He's going to have to be solid. He's going to have to use all of the experience that he has. He's going to have to get the best out of the players to be able to perform here. And so I think it's going to be one of the most interesting Premiership seasons for a long time. This one, and I say that I'm not a neutral. I'm very much biased towards Celtic in this respect, but it will be I think it will be a much closer season than a lot of people realise, because of the context of what's happened.
Yeah, I also think that, just to finish off, I think that, you know, his first stint at Celtic, you know, that first season we're invincible, and then kind of we win the treble the second season, and then he leaves halfway through the third one. We didn't always play the most sparkling of football, and I think obviously the last two seasons under Ange Postecoglou has really woken up the Celtic support to, not only do we need to win things, we need to do it in a certain style. And I think Rodgers really needs to realise that. And I think I think he's smart enough that he will realise that we have to play good football. And so I'm really interested to see how he does that. I think that's a kind of interesting point of view.
Look, I'm a Leeds United fan who has never been happier than when Marcelo Bielsa was coaching my club. And we went through the same process, right? Ange and Marcelo, very, very similar guys, 100% authentic individuals. Both want to play really a flamboyant attacking football, and they want to entertain the fans. And I know that, you know, there's that interview with Ange where he talks about there has to always be meaning outside of simply getting results. Marcelo Bielsa is absolutely the same. And the big question for I think, and I don't think Leeds fans realised how much it was going to hit them. When you go from a coach like that, who brings you some of the best football you're going to watch, who makes you love your club unconditionally, because the realization is there that, you know, this is what it's about. It's about the fans enjoying what the manager produces through the players on the pitch. Who cares about the owners? Who cares about all of this nonsense that is being talked about in the media all the time? It is simply a love affair between fans in the stand, the players on the pitch, and the coach getting them to do things.
Yeah.
And it's a really, really hard dynamic to come into and replace, because the fans remember that, and they remember that feeling. And it, as we said before, it's not just about the winning. The winning helps, obviously, but and if Brendan Rodgers comes in and wins all of the games this season, obviously people aren't going to care that much. But the problem is if you don't win, very quickly the fans wise up, and they say, not only are we losing, we're not experiencing that feeling that we did under Ange, and that's going to be a really tough, I think, act to follow, really, for Brendan Rodgers. So yeah, he's going to have to hit the ground running.
Absolutely fantastic as always, John. An absolute pleasure. Thanks for getting involved, sir.
Thank you so much,
Christian Wulff. A joy as always. Speak to you soon.
Speak to you soon.
I'm Chris Gallagher, and this has been Tactics Talk.